So in this video I played the Resident Evil 3 remake in 2023 for the first time. I'll give an overall review and my thoughts on the game to let you all know if it still holds up over 3 years later. Of course this is a reimagined version of the 1999 original Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, so it's just like the RE2 remake which I played in the last review. It's filled with new gameplay features, a similar yet revamped storyline, and incredible modern day graphics. So if you go on to enjoy or find this review helpful, then let me know by tapping that like button down below, and if you like story games then maybe consider subscribing to the channel. I have an array of videos on various games and series if you'd like to check them all out afterwards. Now let's jump into Resident Evil 3 in 2023. I'd like to start off with the gameplay, which is very similar to the RE2 remake in terms of the same features of navigation and combat being there, just as they were before, but nowhere near having the same effect as it did in RE2. I'll explain this more instead of what the gameplay features are, because there's really no difference at all, which I sort of expected as there's not really much to change. I'll try to briefly list them throughout the video, but not as in depth as my last review, which is in the top corner of the screen now for you to watch if you'd like more detail on them all. The main problem and the biggest aspect that me and the majority of players enjoyed in the second game was how you'd always have to think tactically in lots of areas, like the items you hold, the areas you have to constantly backtrack to multiple times, the different puzzles that you have to really think about, and all of these just emphasizing that feeling of wanting to escape and be motivated to finish, which is exactly what I mentioned in my review of the game. Whereas in Resident Evil 3 it's nowhere near that level, and they seem to have gone down more of a too fast paced and action packed route, and to some people that may sound really fun. The action kicks off as soon as you start the game with huge amounts of enemies swarming you, which was missing from the last game. Even you as a player feel very experienced and more of an expert in combat and defense when taking on these zombies, and of course Nemesis himself, who I'll talk more about later. As I mentioned, I'm fully aware that many people would enjoy this playstyle, which was very different from before and has a huge change in pace. From the surface it does sound fun to play for me as well, but I didn't think they'd fully strip down on the tactical side. Before there were endless amounts of moments when you have to unlock an area by finding 1 or 2 items that were dotted around the entire area and not easy to locate due to them being behind locked doors or areas barricaded, meaning you have to backtrack or find another item to overcome a completely different problem, which was fun and what the main gameplay of Resident Evil is about. In Resident Evil 3 however, there's very minimal areas that stop you or get in your way that mean you have to go all the way back through the city. Sure, there's the odd one, but nowhere near as filled as Resident Evil 2. Almost all the obstacles are incredibly easy to overcome, like the solution being right next to it or a short distance across the road to grab another item. The main problems you encounter are just very predictable moments with the Nemesis over and over. In RE2 only 1 or 2 encounters with Mr. X were scripted, only really the moment when you meet him and the last moment you see him, so that dread and feeling of unease just shoots up very quickly when you know he's there following your footsteps and can pop out at any moment, all down to your own movement, whereas the Nemesis is so scripted and you running right into a triggered cutscene or the very end obstacle you have to get around before you reach the very end. It all feels too scripted and linear, not really giving you that feeling before, mainly due to the gameplay straying away from you having to go back and forth through many different hallways and doors that lead into more rooms with the villain following you and your every move and genuinely stalking you. RE2 is unpredictable, all down to you bumping into him and how you move about as a player whilst trekking across the whole building. It feels way more independent and unique in every single playthrough, whereas RE3 doesn't, and it always feels fixed to all players, no matter how they navigate around. There's no other option on how you play, whether that be overcoming obstacles or how you get away from the Nemesis. It's all the same every time, meaning unlike RE2 there's pretty much no replayability whatsoever. It's the same every time and the same to each player. There are many enemy types you encounter throughout the game, with a handful of new ones which was good. Of course there's the standard zombie we've seen and are the most common, but there's also the Nemesis infested zombie, which is a variant made by Nemesis himself, meaning their heads grow tentacles for extra reach and has a slightly more complex way of killing by not shooting their head first as it's protected, so instead you shoot their body until you see the orange on their face and you can then headshot it, which was a fun set of variation along with all the other types, such as the Hunter Beta version which charges at you, and the opposite being Hunter Gamma, a giant frog-like creature that tries to swallow you up up as an instant kill and have a good amount of speed to them. Then there's Drain Demos, which are spider bug-like creatures who scatter along walls and ceilings, and Sprint at you to perform a parasite attack, where you'll have to remove the toxin from your body with herbs. Of course there's the usual Licker as well, that's just as terrifying as before, with incredible speed to them and of course that long tongue, and the standard zombie dogs as well. So it's good that we have more new enemy types than the old ones. It would have been so fun and scary to encounter them with constantly backtracking through areas and in tight spaces. It seems to only be when entering a new area or passing through. There is of course Nemesis as well, who I'll talk more in depth about with the story. There is a small selection of new weapons to choose from as well, alongside all the other ones we've seen before. There's the burst variation of the handgun, which of course shoots multiple bullets in one burst, making it a lot more efficient to take down zombies. The Ray Den, using electrical charge and stops enemies only when you target the weak points, and the infinite versions of the AR pistol and rocket launcher, which does take away from the item management a bit, as I mentioned earlier, and the more tactical playstyle, because you'll never run out of ammo, but to some people I can see how that would be extremely helpful. Now this brings me on to the world of Resident Evil 3, which just like the gameplay features also follows the same as the last game, with some areas being different for good and others simply rushed. The game is still set in the fictional area of Raccoon City, funny enough only 24 hours before the events of RE2, meaning that the outbreak has just started and the majority of the game is set in the outside of the city, but also follows the same exact location of the RPD office, which you of course thoroughly explore top to bottom in RE2. However, there are many locations that are cut in RE3, the clock tower, the cemetery, etc. Now I know to everyone this might not be a big deal, but I just feel like if they are going to do a remake of a game that follows the exact same location as the previous remake, then it has to include everything else, or at least have new areas to make up for them, but they don't. Bearing in mind for the majority of the game we were exploring the inside of the RPD station, and now we have the freedom to explore, well, not really a lot, even though there was so much opportunity there with us being outside for the majority of the game. But there's an abundance of zombies in the street, either eating corpses or trying to break through barricades. No matter how many you kill, there will always be a new set of them the next time you come out into the open. They did do a good job at showcasing the chaos of the city with endless amount of vehicles blocking roads, and on their side with numerous fires happening everywhere you look. It's just a shame there was no major new location for more exploration, especially with them removing others. There was the odd location that was fun to play in, such as the power station, where you go into the power plant that's infested with drain demos and have taken over the walls and ceilings that look incredible and with so much detail, just showcasing how much they can cover. It really just made me want to blow it all up and get out of there, meaning I tried to activate the 4 generators as quick as possible, along with not knowing when a creature is going to pop out behind you or one crawling on the ceiling above you, which is similar to the same feeling and excitement you'd get all the time in similar situations in RE2, but just not as much this time round. Lastly, I'd like to talk about the story of the game with no major spoilers, which as I mentioned, the game is set 24 hours before RE2, and by this point the majority of the city has been infected and already mutated due to the outbreak. You follow and play as the character of Jill Valentine, who is a former member of the RPD's STARS, meaning Special Tactics and Rescue Services, starting off the game in her apartment and already meeting with Nemesis, the main antagonist of the game. You then meet with the characters of Carlos and the rest of the UBCS mercenaries, also known as the Umbrella Biohazard Countermeasure Service, who you'll learn more about as you progress through. You all follow the goal of setting up the trains in the subway station so you can evacuate the city along with the civilians. However, there's obviously going to be problems you face along the way, and I'm saying now that it's not as easy as it sounds. It isn't just an on switch and then you can leave. Although there aren't complex and backtracking puzzles, there are inconveniences that slow down the process slightly, which I won't spoil. That's the opening, and the entire story is very short, unfortunately. This is due to them cutting the corners seen in the last game, as I mentioned in the gameplay. Because of this being missing, it creates a slightly rushed and quick paced narrative. The main side characters throughout the whole game would be Carlos and Nikolai. Carlos you also control as a character alongside Jill. Carlos's personality is already portrayed really well in this game, with humorous quotes showcasing his sort of laid back attitude. He's fairly confident as well, as if he knows what he's doing, but also not as serious as Jill's tone, who follows a more focused persona. You being able to play as Carlos in sections of the game, of course does allow for more depth in his character compared to a usual side character, and you're able to stand in his shoes and experience his perspective of everything. You get to see him explore the RPD, which felt so surreal to see the same place hours apart from each other in 2 different games, and you learn a lot more about what happened before Leon and Claire turned up, as well as exactly what happened to the character of Marvin, who you encounter at the very start of RE2, as well as more depth into other characters and moments spread throughout the story. Carlos helps and follows Jill after meeting her early on, and plays a significant role in the story that adds a lot. One of the biggest aspects is Carlos's character development, which is clear as you progress, with that laid back tone becoming more caring in a way and showing more sympathy, as well as being aware that he's holding a lot of responsibility in saving civilians, and that also means that the connection with Jill becomes a lot stronger. Overall, I found his character more likeable as I played. Then Nikolai is almost the opposite. Although being a member of the UBCS like Carlos, his character is way more cold and comes across as very selfish, because it's clear that he wants to fulfill his own goals for himself rather than work as a team, going all the way to achieve his own objective that gets way too out of hand, which I won't talk much more about. His character development is just as good, maybe even better than Carlos's. His persona gradually changes for the worse, and Jill and Carlos slowly start to question it. Without saying too much, his character is very important to the story and upgrades it a lot, mixed with the main antagonist of the Nemesis, who's a giant tyrant. Tyrant being a bioorganic weapon that's being engineered as part of the Tyrant project, meaning he's more advanced due to being a lot smarter and stronger, with the main purpose of killing STAR members as ordered. He doesn't have a personality, as he doesn't show any emotional talk. The only word he does say is simply just stars. That's what he says throughout the whole game. He is very intelligent and obviously extremely hard to take down, just like Mr. X in RE2. You can think you've killed him, but he will be back soon. But as I mentioned in gameplay, this menacing character is sort of taken down by him not being as intense as he sounds. But not to say the scripted moments are bad. They are varied and cool to watch and showcase his character extremely well. They make his character seem unstoppable, mixed with the incredible detail in his design. You really can't fault it. After many boss fights of him being almost taken down, but then returning with a new transformation, this being his mask left of it, with discoloured skin and decaying body, his teeth and claws stretching out, basically just absolutely horrific, which Resident Evil always score top marks in. And lastly, there's the main protagonist of Jill Valentine, who's portrayed, just as I mentioned, as a very experienced, tough member of the STARS, being very determined and focused on what she does and extremely capable of pretty much everything, in contrast to pretty much every other side character at the start. Just like in Leon and Claire, as well as other smaller characters in RE2, the game also looks at her personal struggles and her losses throughout her life, leading to trauma during the whole apocalypse. This also means we learn more about her backstory and in-depth links to events. Overall, it provides for a slightly more varied narrative and change in pace, as well as building that relationship with Carlos and the connection with the player. And that's where I wrap up my review of Resident Evil 3 the remake in 2023. Overall, it's a lot more action packed than before, with a handful of areas where it did cut corners and it executed aspects poorly. This doesn't make for a bad game, and I would still say to check it out, but just be aware that it's very different in pacing and overall doesn't have the same impact, I would say, as it should, due to the pacing being slightly rushed and the many moments I've mentioned throughout the whole video. But that's everything, and if you did enjoy the review and found it helpful, then let me know by tapping that like button down below. And if you enjoyed story video games, then I have various reviews on the channel on a bunch of games, with a playlist of a series I've done in the description down below. Thank you for watching until the end, and bye bye.